Hi, friends of Tirtzu. Thank you so much for being here. We're back with Tirtzu's Zionist Salon, and I'm very pleased to be joined today with Emily Schrader. Hi, Emily.
Hi.
Emily is our Hasbara superstar. She's a columnist for the Jerusalem Post, and she's the founder of the Lite creative digital marketing company. So, Emily, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Thank you. So I wanted to start off with really your personal story, right? I understand that you weren't born in Israel, you were born in the US. How did you, find yourself really going here to live in Israel? And how did you approach, or how did you find about your, really your passion about Israel advocacy?
So I could go on about this alone for like a couple hours, so I'll try to keep it as short as I can. But I was always very politically involved. I'm originally from Los Angeles. And when I was on campus at USC, they had a lot of anti-Israel activity. And I was involved in many political groups, but not Israel stuff. Even though I always supported Israel, I grew up supporting Israel, my family supports Israel, but I wasn't really that knowledgeable. And then I saw the apartheid wall. Wow. And I'm sure, like, if you know anything about Israel advocacy, for anyone who's watching, they do this thing on campus where they put up like a mock apartheid wall, which is really just the security barrier, of course, and they put all kinds of information on it that's filled with lies about Israel and Israel's history and what the situation is between Israel and the Palestinians. And I saw this. I didn't know, it was the first time I'd ever seen it.
Were you a student back then?
I was a student, yeah. And I was walking with my friend who was in the Students for Israel there, and I got really mad. I was like, what is wrong with these people? Why are they obsessed with Jews? Like, why can't they go do something else? Because even at the time, it was like Students for Justice in Palestine and like the communist group or something. And it wasn't Palestinian students. It wasn't even the Arab students on campus at the time. It was like random other kids. Wow. So I was so like taken aback because like, why do they care? Why are they involved in this? And she's like, if you're so mad, maybe you should join the Students for Israel. And I was like, I don't have time for that. 2 weeks later, I was on the board of the Students for Israel. So that's sort of how I first got involved. And then I really became more active because they had like a community, open to the community BDS, not hearing, but information session about how to promote BDS in your community. Wow. And they didn't know who I was because I hadn't been that vocal on campus. So I went because I wanted to hear what they had to say. Nice. And they didn't recognize me. And of course it was all like nonsense about Israel, but they recognized someone else who walked in. And there was a big confrontation between them, and the campus security came, and they ended up kicking out the other person who was like a known Zionist. And I wrote about it for the school newspaper, and I contacted the dean, and then Students for Justice in Palestine got suspended for 2 years. So, so that's really where things sort of took off, and then I got involved with various organizations. So,
and I have to say, you were, kind of like describing the people taking part in Students for Justice in Palestine, and with the BDS wall and everything. Do you feel like a big portion of those people happen to be Jews or have some sort of a Jewish connection to it? Do they feel like they're Jews having to explain where they're coming from?
So I think this is one thing that shifted from the time that I was at USC to now. At the time, there was maybe 1 or 2, and they would self-identify as a communist, even if they had like a Jewish background. But really, no, it's like random white kids. Now we see sort of a shift with organizations like JVP and If Not Now and these groups. So there are more like extreme, I would say, fringe left-wing groups that are being a lot more vocal about that stuff. And even now, I wrote about this in my column last week, that Jews are feeling pressure to like choose one side or the other. And I think that that's a really dangerous and toxic, false dichotomy that the diaspora is facing now.
Yeah, can't help to agree. Now I want to take this over to really your expertise, social media. We've been seeing all the time, that hasn't been just happening lately, but we can see that a lot of times the big tech companies, right, it feels like, they kind of, allow anti-Israel inciting posts to just, go viral and go wild on the net, while, pro-Israel posts are really getting pushed to the side, to say the least. Yeah. So what do you think about that? Do you think that's actually a phenomenon that's happening? And how can we, try and change it?
So I definitely think that that's something that's happening. I think it's actually getting worse. There was a period of time after, there was a wave of stabbing attacks in 2015, as I'm sure you know. And this came directly in connection with incitement to violence on social media, particularly in Palestinian social media in Arabic. And Facebook delayed in removing this content, also YouTube and other platforms, but especially Facebook. There was even, the name of it was the Stabbing Intifada. That was their hashtag. And they didn't remove the content, or they removed it very, very slowly, and we kept seeing violence occurring. After this, Facebook sort of caught up. They're much better now about incitement to violence directly than they were. But everything else, it's just as bad, if not worse.
What triggered it? Like, what made Facebook, for example, kind of like, you know, realize that they're crossing a line here?
With the incitement to violence? The Jewish community. Jewish community in Israel pushed back hard against what we were seeing. I was also very active. I went and spoke in multiple Knesset committees about what we were seeing, the trends that we were seeing in Arabic on social media. But it also occurs in other languages too. And another thing that I've been doing since is pushing for the IRA definition adoption by social media companies for exactly this reason. We see anti-Semitism rising and rising and rising, and they keep sticking their head in the sand saying like, oh no, it's not anti-Zionism, and, you know, it's not the same thing. It is. Anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism are the same thing. And unfortunately, because they've ignored us for years, we see the result of it now with all the anti-Semitism that's occurring around the world, and it's getting worse.
Yeah, it seems so. Can you please elaborate on that? Like, how do you explain anti-Zionism actually equals anti-Semitism? How does that work for you?
Well, I think that if you look at the language, social media is actually a great example, first of all. If you look at the language and even the graphics that are used from anti-Zionists, you see that it's just replacing the word Zionist, or replacing the word Jews with Zionist over and over and over again. And also the graphics. So many of the cartoons that we see depicting you know, Israeli leaders or the state of Israel are anti-Semitic. They have anti-Semitic caricatures in them. You know, the Jews with the hooked noses, and Jews are demons, and all of these classic tropes. And you just see Israel instead of Jews. What they really mean by it is, of course, Jews. And it happens from the far left. It happens from the far right, too. The neo-Nazis online. You know, there's a reason that, like, David Duke, who's like the KKK Grandmaster, whatever his ridiculous title is, talks about the global Zionist elite. We know he's an anti-Semite. We know he's the freaking KKK leader. So it's very, very clear in the language that they use that they're talking about Jews. And what's even more scary is that you see people who are self-declared social justice leaders like Linda Sarsour using the exact same language, especially on social media. But yeah, I think it's something that we really need to draw attention to. Really need to continue to draw attention to online.
Now, you touched on the IRA definition for anti-Semitism. Can you please tell me more a little about that? I understand that you were still really active about promoting the IRA's definition for anti-Semitism. Can you please tell me what you're doing about that, you know, what the definition actually means, how it all started, and where it stands now?
Right. So the IRA definition stands for the it's a long name, International Holocaust Remembrance Association working definition of anti-Semitism. And this came from a consensus of Jewish professionals, academics, and also organizations who wanted a better understanding of how anti-Semitism manifests today. Because, of course, we see that it's not just with old school, you know, classic anti-Semitism, but also with what I described as, you know, replacing the word Jews with Zionists. That doesn't mean, of course, and the definition explicitly states this, it doesn't mean that criticizing Israeli policy is anti-Semitic. It doesn't even mean that criticizing the concept of Zionism is anti-Semitic. But the way that it's used today is most often anti-Semitic. And that's something we have to acknowledge, because if we don't, we see the results like we see today with anti-Semitism rising all over in the name of anti-Zionism. And it's not that it would be okay, but it's not just Israelis being targeted around the world. It's Jews. Of course, people who have no connection to Israel other than maybe the fact that they're Jewish, who are like, well, you know, why are you killing Palestinian kids? They're being asked this question. What?
So where does it stand now? Like, can you tell me how many countries or how many organizations support the definition?
So Over 34 countries have adopted the definition. There are other ones who have signed on to it without a formal adoption. Many organizations, Jewish and non-Jewish, have adopted the definition.
And includes, student bodies and things like that,
Yeah,
right?
also many universities have used it. Sports teams have adopted it. And I think it's important to note that the purpose of the definition isn't to censor any form of speech, but rather so that people will understand what anti-Semitism is and be able to identify that. And for me, that's key because I'm not someone who supports censorship. Even, I'm pretty broad with that, and maybe some people within IRA would disagree with me. I'm not in favor of removing everything just because it's anti-Semitic. I think that the social media networks have an obligation to educate people about it. So if you see something that's anti-Semitic, it needs to say the majority, the consensus Jewish community, which is who supports the IRA definition, the consensus Jewish community views this as anti-Semitic, and here's why, and with more information. So that's what I've always pushed for. Now, of course, there are limits to that. Anytime it's direct hate speech or direct incitement to violence, then there's a risk, and a risk that can be proven. Obviously, this should be removed.
Okay, so we've touched on anti-Zionism, really, and I can't help but ask, people who are so anti-Zionist or anti-Israeli, right? They go to demonstrations, you see them, rally up everywhere. Of course, we were talking about incitement over social media. What do you think are the biggest misconceptions that might lead them, to actually being so violently anti-Israel and anti-Zionist? And how can we deal with it, right?
Yeah.
So you touched on that a little. I'd like to elaborate and really give us ideas of how we can battle that.
So I think one of the biggest challenges today that is actually something pretty new that we haven't seen a few years ago even is that all of this is being done in the name of social justice or in the name of, and I don't like saying this because I'm not a right-wing person in my politics, but the whole woke culture idea. And the thing that's crazy about it is that if you look at history, all of human history, the Jews are the most oppressed people in the history of mankind.
No doubt.
There's no question about this. And yet somehow Jews are continuously excluded from this discussion. And the way that people who talk about these issues, they want to put Jews in the category of white people. Jews have never been white. Not Ashkenazim, not Mizrahim. No Jews have ever been white throughout all of human history.
Yeah.
And to say they're white passing when it comes to discussions of privilege, maybe sometimes in some circumstances, but that's not what they're doing. Yeah. They're not actually interested in having a debate about privilege. They're interested in excluding Jews from the discussion and saying Jews have privilege and no other minority does. They don't even want to say that Jews are a minority. This is just another form of anti-Semitism. And it's scary because on the right you have neo-Nazis, okay? But they say they hate Jews. And they've always said they hate Jews. And on the far left, you have people who are like, oh, it's for the good of humanity. It's for the society. We're promoting justice. That's not justice. And when you're covering it up the way that they do, that's very dangerous. Very. And unfortunately, we see the result now.
But obviously, I want to believe that at least most of them, right, especially the, social justice type of people that you were mentioning, they probably have a sense of just to their cause, right? So what do you think might be behind it? How do they justify, right, standing with Palestinians, regardless of what's happening with Israelis, and supporting their free Palestine cause no matter what?
Well, first of all, it's a lot of ignorance. Obviously, the majority of them don't think that they're doing anything wrong.
Of course.
But they don't know. They don't know what the actual situation is. And I think, especially in the West, there's a member of Congress, Richie Torres, he's actually a Democrat, who talked about this during the last conflict. There is this, I guess, pressure in the United States to Americanize everything. Okay. Everything that happens in the world, you want to understand it through the lens of America or the history of America. And we see that with how Black Lives Matter has co-opted the Palestinian cause, even though it has nothing to do with it. In fact, probably the opposite. And we see it with other movements for social justice in the United States that may very well be important and just and whatever. But to put the Palestinian cause with that is not accurate. And they've portrayed it as the Palestinians being these innocent victims of Israel and what Israel is doing, the oppressed versus the oppressor. When, like I said, the reality of the situation, if we look at all of human history, is that the Jews are the most oppressed people. If that's how you want to look at it, that's the truth. and they obscure the facts and the history in order to present the Palestinians as being the victims. When in reality, I don't dispute completely that they're victims, but they're not victims of Israelis.
Yeah.
They're victims of their own government, which has continued to oppress them and continues to today.
Right. So I'm happy you touched on that because, a lot of times people say that our traditional Hasbara tends to go really to the defense side, right? We don't use offense. And for example, you were talking about the PA, right? And Hamas and all those really, those people supporting them. And really, if you ask me, they're not just about being anti-Israel, right? They've forgotten their people.
They're anti-Palestinian.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So basically, what do you think about our Hasbara efforts? Do you think that we should go more to the offense? Do you think we should really, expose all the bigotry that Hamas, the PA, and everyone else really expresses or represents? What's your stance about that?
So I do think we should be more on the offensive, but not necessarily in the way that you think. Okay. I think that we need to stop making a separation between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And I think that as a whole, whether it's Israelis or the diaspora Jewry, need to come together against the anti-Zionism that we see and be more aggressive on that front. I think we need to fight back from within the whole social justice narrative and the dialogue that's occurring now because we're losing because people don't know. People don't know what Jewish history is. Sometimes even Jewish communities don't really know their own history or they don't know how to talk about it. And that's like the big change that I see that needs to happen. So I do think we need to go on the offensive. And another article that I wrote last week about this exactly is that we need to stop expecting Jews to answer for the actions of Israel. And a lot of times people say that because they're like, oh, I'm not responsible for Israel. I condemn Israel. No, I don't mean like that. I mean that the second someone expects a Jew anywhere in the world or an Israeli or even someone who supports Israel to answer for whatever the state of Israel has done, unless you're Naftali Bennett or the spokesman of the IDF himself, I don't care what your position is. If you support two states, if you don't support two states, if you hate Palestinians, if you don't hate Palestinians, I don't care. And anyone who's asking a Jew that question is anti-Semitic. Yeah. Whether they realize it or not, it's anti-Semitic.
They come from a stand that they already blaming that person for being Jewish or Israeli or whatever.
Yeah. So I think we need to be much more aggressive about calling this out even. The Jewish community in Texas doesn't need to make a statement about what the army has done. I understand there's anti-Semitism. I understand other people are placing that pressure, but our response should be, go to hell. Yeah. Okay. We don't need to answer to you. We don't owe you anything. We don't owe anybody an answer as to what or why Israel is doing what they're doing, ever. And I'm sick of hearing about it. I'm sick of people saying, well, how do I answer? If you want to answer, great. You want to be an Israel advocate and an activist like me? Awesome. Educate yourself on the facts and create content and understand how to talk to people about what's happening. But for someone to expect it from you is wrong. And we need to call that out. So I do think we should be more on the offensive about that.
Okay. Yeah. No, I can see what you mean. Now, okay, then let's take it from the, average Joe, from the average person to Israel. What do you think the biggest obstacle for Israel is? What can it do to help itself?
Like politically speaking, or?
Yes, everything is really political, if I may say. But yeah, when it comes to being anti-Israel, all the criticism that we hear all over the world.
So I think, first of all, I think that there's a misconception that Israel has really bad Hasbara, which might surprise you. I think that Israelis and a lot of organizations, and in fact, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Prime Minister's office actually, and also, of course, the IDF, have Hasbara, have a PR that's really unmatched by anywhere else in the world because they have to. And they've done a pretty good job, all things considered, with getting out accurate information, especially the IDF, also in Arabic, getting out the raw footage of the stuff that they're, whatever they need to do, they're proving that they need to do it. Is it always as fast as it should be? It's easy for us to say no. But in an ideal world, we would immediately have answers for everything, but it's not an ideal world. And I think that all things considered, they did a pretty good job with this last operation. They did a great job with the Great March of Return, the protests on the Gaza border, not even protests, riots on the Gaza border, at getting out proof for what they were seeing, what was happening, that this wasn't a peaceful riot, that these were people who were actually placing explosives on the border and trying to kill people. So in terms of that, Israel does a very good job. The problem with social media and also international media is that we're outnumbered. And this is even more exaggerated on social media. Even if every single pro-Israel person and Jew in the world was pro-Israel and spent every day tweeting and posting about this, we would still be outnumbered. So it's an uphill battle. And people always ask me, well, then what's the point? You know, I don't want to get involved. I don't want to get involved in social media because it's such a mess. I understand that. I'm not telling anyone that they have to be. But even small things make a difference, because if we don't even show up, it's not about winning the fight. It's about showing up. And if you see only dialogue that is anti-Israel, it will get more extreme. It does get more extreme. It's always like this, because people see, you know, 5 years ago, oh, Israel is killing kids, you know, a myth that is very popular with anti-Israel activists. Israel's killing kids. And you're not really someone who's involved. You don't really know. You have no connection to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but you see this claim, and maybe there's a video, maybe it's fake, maybe not, who knows. 2 years later, you see the same thing. 2 years later, you see the same thing. And you think, oh my gosh, like, this is horrible. This is genocide. And all these inflammatory languages is being used. Ethnic cleansing, genocide, apartheid, over and over and over again. All of them are false, completely false. But it doesn't matter, because it keeps being repeated. And if you don't see, like, oh wow, there's a huge debate even in this comment section, maybe, you know, the person who's uninvolved will stay away. But at least they know that there's a debate and that there's another side. And I also want to say that every single action you take on social media actually does make a difference, because everything works on algorithm. So even if it's 50 people who are liking a comment, it can make a difference. And if there's more people who like a comment that is correcting misinformation on BBC or the New York Times or whatever, and that's the first comment that's displayed, well, then everywhere that article is, that first comment will be displayed too. So this is something really, really important to know about social media, that every single thing you do and every single interaction you have matters.
Activity on social media, right?
Yeah.
So whatever you do, like, be present.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah.
And speaking again of social media, can you tell me more about your company, Lite Creative? What does it do? You know, if you can tell me some of your biggest challenges or biggest achievements, that'd be great.
Yeah, so I started the company with my partner Zina about 2 years ago. And basically we specialize in working with nonprofits, also we worked in some projects with the Israeli government, and also startups unrelated to that, on social media, digital marketing. So that includes ads, it also includes content. That's sort of our specialty, is content. With websites, blogs, social media, all of this stuff. We do video, we do graphic design, everything is in-house. And I would say one of the biggest challenges we've had, that of course is ongoing, it's been a challenge for everyone, was we work with Magen David Adom. We do a lot of their English content, and obviously everything with coronavirus was a huge challenge, not only health-wise, but also, you know, from educating the public from the beginning and getting the word out about what to do, where to go, what not to do, what are the rules, because the rules are changing all the time. So this was very, very difficult for us, and the follow-up also with the vaccine rollout, but it's also been really rewarding. So I would say it's also one of our successes. It's been really rewarding to be able to see what an impact they've had in the state of Israel. And something that's like really, really inspiring about it is that even in like the conflict that we had with Hamas a few weeks ago, Magen David Adom is, and also all the health system in Israel, is really exceptional in that they have such diversity and they work together so well. You know, something Muslims, Christians, right? Exactly. It's just such a great example for everyone, but of course the rest of society in Israel, of how we can work together. Yeah. So I would say that's our biggest challenge, and also our most rewarding. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
I want to take you back to what we were talking just earlier. You were talking about really, you know, us being outnumbered. So, you know, speaking of what the, again, average Joe can do to help, you know, being active over social media, I wanted to ask you about really other countries and international media, even international leaders, right? Because I feel like, you know, we can have the best the best intentions in the world, right? But we're just like, we're really outnumbered. We really have no chance when it comes to almost 8 billion people in the world. So what would be your message to international leaders or, opinion leaders, opinion influencers, sorry. Like, what would you tell them?
I guess it depends on which influencers. Yeah. But no, when it comes to world leaders, I think that there's different perspectives. So on the one hand, we see a lot of very anti-Israel activity in bodies like the UN. On the other hand, we don't actually see a lot of countries themselves who are anti-Israel. Really? Why? Because Israel has really proven themselves on the global sphere. And what we provide to the world is really unmatched, especially for a country as small as we are, in terms of technology, in terms of health, in terms of even diplomacy. So I think Israel is very established and is clearly not going anywhere. And anybody who's a rational politician and world leader is going to recognize this. I think that when it comes to the pressure that we face when Israel has conflict or in the UN, there is no better solution than just calling it for what it is and calling it out and exposing it. And when there are world leaders who are, vociferously anti-Israel, like you had with Jeremy Corbyn before, or I don't remember, Margaret, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, and what's her name in Sweden, Margaret Wallström, the former foreign minister. You can't, there's a point where you can't negotiate with these people when they come with a certain agenda. And with Rashida Tlaib, it was very obvious from day one what her agenda was. And unfortunately, it's not representing her people in Detroit. It's apparently representing the Palestinians. Who knew that Palestine was a congressional district? I had no idea. The things you learn. But yeah, you have to just call it out for what it is. There's no other way to go about it. And yeah, some people are going to go against you and some people aren't. And I think it's also important to come at it from the angle of, this isn't, as an American, I'm telling you, this is not the Democratic Party. It's not. They're trying to make it the Democratic Party.
It might be changing, like the Labour Party is in the UK.
Yeah, they're trying, but they're still the minority. And I think that it's incumbent upon Democrats in the U.S. to push this out. And we haven't seen that enough. We haven't seen it enough. Not from Nancy Pelosi, not from some of the Democratic leaders have been really, really great about it, and some of them haven't. But they do need to do this because aside from Israeli politics, the U.S.-Israel relationship is really important for the United States. And I think that there's also a lack of general knowledge about this too among the public in the U.S.
Okay, so educate.
Yes.
Sure. And one last question, please. What do you think, really, if we can look afar, right, to the ideal, what do you think the biggest obstacle towards really peace or, to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is? How would you solve it?
A simple question, very simple question. So there's a lot of factors, obviously. But I think that if I had to identify one single factor, it would be the infighting between the Palestinians. I think that on the left or the right in Israel, you've had leaders who are at least willing to sit down and talk continuously throughout, I think, the entire state of Israel. And even if Mahmoud Abbas came today and said, I want to have peace talks and I want a state and we're gonna make peace, he can't. He doesn't have the strength from his own society to do that. Why? Because they've created a culture that glorifies terrorism, that teaches hate, that's fueled on a narrative that's false. And so there's nothing that can be done in terms of even for Palestinian leaders right now, other than change your education system, change what you're teaching people, teach people peace instead of the nonsense that you're teaching them today. Because otherwise you're just going to continue to have this cycle and you're going to continue to have infighting between Hamas and Fatah like you have now, and neither is going to be able to make peace because there's too many people against them on both sides.
Okay, so I want to make it harder for you because obviously right now they're unwilling. How would you, use maybe the international community? Would you expect Israel to, have a different stand towards the PA or Hamas and Fatah? What would you say?
I don't think there's anything wrong with Israel's stance towards the PA. I think that using international pressure on the Palestinians should happen. I actually think that everything that Trump did when it comes to Palestinians is exactly what needs to happen. The pressure needs to be applied continuously and stronger until the Palestinians understand that Israel isn't going anywhere. And the more they delay and the more they don't want to negotiate and the more they promote violence and terrorism, the more it's going to hurt them in the end. And we've seen it for decades. And it's like they just don't learn. You know, they say that they never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. It's true. And it's very sad, actually. It's very sad because future generations of Palestinians are going to be left in this mess because they're failed and incompetent leadership. So I think one of the best things to come from the Abraham Accords is that you started to see a shift in the Arab world, of the Arab world recognizing, okay, this is ridiculous. It's not in our interest to continue to support the Palestinians who are shooting themselves in the foot. It's better to work with Israel and to, you know, okay, we can still support, you know, we don't want anything bad to happen to them, but the reality is the reality and they need to learn to deal with it. So the more we have other nations on board with us, especially in the Arab League, within the Arab League, the stronger the pressure is going to be on the Palestinian Authority to act. Additionally, in the West, all these countries that are providing ridiculous amounts of aid to the Palestinian Authority need to re-examine this. Obviously, I was against restoring aid to UNRWA. I think that's a huge, huge, huge mistake. And restoring funding to the Palestinian Authority, at least the situation as it stands now, is absurd. While they're still paying terrorists.
That's a good point.
But, you know, what can we do? We can just continue to educate people about it and try to work with our leaders in whatever country they may be, maybe Canada or the United States or UK.
Amazing. This was fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Really, thank you so much for being here and really keep on your good work.
Thanks.
I wish you all the best, good luck, and hope to see you soon again.
Thanks.